Good afternoon and welcome to today's panel on museums and their approach to provenance. I'm Teresa Krasny. I'm a member of the board of ICRA, and I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by three excellent representatives of the museum world. We have Iris Schmeisser from the Städel Museum in Frankfurt, Susanna Avery-Quash from the National Gallery here in London, and Tori Reed from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So I will hand it over to the panelists now to talk a little more about their experience in this field. Iris, could we start with you?
While the Städel Museum in Frankfurt has systematically conducted Nazi-era provenance research since 2001, I have only been with the museum in that capacity since 2014. I am responsible for all areas of provenance research at the Städel, such as identifying works that have been unlawfully taken from their previous owners during the Nazi era, monitoring works with provenance gaps in the collection, checking works for outgoing loans, reviewing works and their legal information before they are installed in our galleries, due diligence for acquisitions, preparing provenance data for our online collection, overseeing the museum's institutional archives and the processing of its records, and working with curators across departments and our education and communication staff on the display of object and collection histories in our galleries and online. And even though it is complicated, I will just give you a brief overview of our museum's holdings, which are essentially composed of two collections with a separate ownership status. First, there's the collection of the Städel Art Institute. It was established as a bequest of the Frankfurt merchant Johann Friedrich Städel in 1815. And the Städel Art Institute is the oldest civic museum foundation in Germany. And it is a private institution run by a board of administrators to this day. Second, we have the collection of the city of Frankfurt. And this collection was established in the early 20th century by the city with a twofold mission: acquiring modern art by living artists and building a collection of ancient and old sculptures, which are displayed at the Liebig House, which is a villa adjacent to the Städel's building. And when the Städel Museum began to conduct systematic provenance research in 2001, it first focused on the acquisitions during the Nazi era and the institution's history during these years, specifically the museum's involvement in the Aryanization of Jewish property. And back then, we slated approximately 550 paintings at the Städel and more than 400 ancient and old sculptures at the Liebig House for research. And in the meantime, we have moved on to concentrate on works on paper and our post-war acquisitions of paintings and sculptures that changed hands or could have changed hands between 1933 and 1945. And significantly, two of our research initiatives received funding from the German state and partially from the city of Frankfurt. And so far, we have 17 objects that we have clearly identified as looted, and our museum was able to find a just and fair solution with the heirs of their previous owners. And as my colleagues here on this panel know, provenance research connects the past with the present. And to research an object's history is a dynamic process, and what we know about a work of art's provenance may change over time when new sources are discovered, sometimes even by accident. And this is why the Städel Museum has started a special initiative to include provenance data in its online collection, thus making accessible what we know and what we don't know about an object's history and its previous owners, which is a work in progress, I have to say.
Thank you, Iris. Susanna, would you like to go next?
So yes, I'm Susanna Avery-Quash, the Senior Research Curator in the History of Collecting National Gallery in London. And I'm in charge of the pre-1900 objects in the gallery's history collection. And I'm responsible for activities associated with two gallery designated research strands, art and religion. And as you can see in my first slide, buying, collecting and display. I'm on the boards of the Society for the History of Collecting and TIAMSA, the International Art Market Studies Association. I'm a trustee of the Francis Haskell Memorial Fund and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, a specialist volunteer for the National Trust too. and I hold honorary research fellowships at Birkbeck, University of London, and Buckingham University's Humanities Research Institute. So my research and publications focus on the study of important private and public art collections, especially the National Gallery, trends in artistic taste, especially for the old masters, and the historical art market. My publications, some of which are up here, include Art for the Nation, that you can see at the top, The East Lakes and the Victorian Art World, that I wrote with Julie Sheldon in 2011. And more recently, down the bottom, the Georgian London Townhouse, Building, Collecting and Display, co-edited with Kate Retford and published in 2019. And Leonardo in Britain, Collections and Historical Reception, edited with Giuliana Baroni, published by Olsky also in 2019. And most recently, Old Masters Worldwide, Markets, Museums and Movements, 1789 to 1914, a multi-author book again, co-edited with Barbara Pezzini and just published last week by Bloomsbury. Concerning provenance research that I've been involved with over my time at the National Gallery, I wanted to flag one particular project, this one I show you here, that started in 1999 to list all the paintings in our permanent collection with incomplete provenances for the period 33 to 45. In light of concern that some works of art in public collections worldwide may have been improperly acquired during that period, as Iris has just mentioned, without restitution having been made, the National Gallery in London paid particular attention to whereabouts of its paintings during those years. In March 1999, with the cooperation of the gallery, the Art newspaper published a list of our paintings which have gaps, but acceptable and not worrying gaps in provenance information. And that research has been made available, as you can see here, on our website. The public is invited to contact us with any new information in those provenances that will help fill those gaps in our knowledge. And in relation to research into past owners of our paintings and the movements of our paintings through the art market over time, I led a couple of collaborations with the Getty Research Institute in California, the first 2010 to 12, the second 2014 to 16. The research partnership investigated historical British art sales over the long period 1680 to 1820 to shed light on the story of the British auction market from its beginnings in the 17th century up to the time when the National Gallery was founded in 1824. As a result of the research done at the National Gallery, the London team was able to find and collate almost 150,000 records from over 2,200 catalogues, and the resulting data has now been entered with already existing material into the Getty Provenance index database, making it available for scholars and the general public worldwide. And with my partner in crime, Christian Huemer at the Getty, I organised a conference after phase one that led on to the publication London and the Emergence of the Art Market, 1780 to 1820, and that book was published in 2019. I think that's a fair summary of the type of work I've been doing in the last few years of relevance to this panel discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Susanna. Tori, turn to you now.
So I am the curator for Provenance at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, or the MFA. I have been at the MFA since 2003. Just a little bit of background on sort of how I got there. I have an MA and PhD in art history, so that's my training. And I started working in museums in 1997. As a graduate student, I worked as a part-time research assistant at the Met, and then really got my feet wet doing provenance research at the Princeton University Art Museum from 2001 to 2003. The Museum of Fine Arts is a private museum. It's an encyclopedic museum. We have over 500,000 objects in the collection. My job began doing Nazi-era provenance research, as we've just heard about from Iris and Susanna, within the Art of Europe department. Since that time, my job has grown, I think, in response to the institution's needs to encompass the entire collection. So I am responsible for sort of overseeing research and documentation for the entire collection of the Museum of Fine Arts, as well as checking the provenance of all potential acquisitions and incoming and outgoing loans. I would say that my position is both sort of inward-facing and outward-facing. Really, the goal of the institution is to be transparent with our research. So a lot of what I do is sort of talking to the public and working with curators on labels and how do we share this information with the public, getting information onto our website. So it's a busy job, but I think you know, we can talk more about the details when we get into the discussion.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So I think let's jump right in, and actually, Tori, I will start with you. You are one of the very few curators dedicated to provenance in the States, and which shows a very strong commitment by the MFA Boston. And I wondered, how does it perceive its responsibility to the provenance of its enormous collection?
So my position is unique within the United States, I would say, and it's unique for two reasons. First of all, it's an endowed position. So the museum has made a financial commitment to conducting provenance research. And this is important because, as I mentioned earlier, we're a private museum. Most museums in the United States are private, and so we really rely on fundraising to open galleries and make acquisitions, and in many cases to fund positions. I would say my position is also unique for a museum of this size and scope to have a centralized role doing provenance research. So I'm really there to ensure consistency and accountability across the curatorial division. I think my position was created not for any reason other than the museum realizes the relative risks of acquiring cultural property, and we're also we are one of the leading institutions in the United States, and I think to that end we're tasked with setting a very high ethical standard. And I guess I would also just add that, you know, we often hear that museums hold their collections in the public trust, and I think that's very true. But that doesn't mean that we just hold on to everything because we want the public to see it. It really means being accountable to our public. It means being accountable to our visitors, to our trustees, to the city, and that means not holding on to or displaying stolen property or improperly acquired materials. So really my role is to ensure that we fulfill this mission by working with the administration and curators on policy and also everyday practice.
Okay, so the field of provenance, I'm sure since you started in 2003, has evolved from a back of house activity to what now appears to be a much more public engagement. Tori, what do you think are the driving forces behind that?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about how the field has changed and how we've become more transparent, I think, as a field. I mean, when I first started working in museums, it was before the Washington Conference of 1998. And in the United States, we don't have any federal laws mandating provenance research. We have museum guidelines. So the first museum guidelines came out in the late 90s, mandating that we begin researching our collections and also sharing the results of that research publicly. So I think the greatest change came with that particular mandate because it dovetailed perfectly with the rise not only of the internet, but also museum websites, right? So you have art historians, curators being tasked with conducting this research, sharing this research, and suddenly provenance went from being something relatively proprietary and sort of the realm of specialists to something that was pretty quickly democratized, information that people could access pretty quickly. So to me, that was really the biggest sea change in attitude, that provenance has become information that everybody is entitled to. While it was sparked by the families of Holocaust victims and their descendants looking for their property, it's really grown to encompass all areas of collecting and all areas of the art market. Over the last 20 years, we've seen in the United States a number of antiquities being repatriated to Italy. We've seen the Frederick Schultz case, which was a lawsuit that sort of drove home the point that curators, specialists need to be aware of legislation from whatever country they're acquiring works of art from. So it's not just enough to conduct due diligence in one area of collecting. We really have to look at archaeological material as well. So we've seen the AAMD issue new collecting guidelines for antiquities in 2008, requiring documented provenance going back to 1970. These are all sort of gradual, these have been sort of gradually accepted. We don't necessarily change the ethics of collecting overnight. I did have a screenshot of our museum website, just to show that when you go to our website, provenance is right there under collections. So even though I'm effectively a department of one, it's still a department and really integral to the mission of the museum. So yes, in terms of how my work has changed, I mean, collectively, I think all of us, and Iris and Susanna probably agree, that we all know collectively much more now than we did when we started. And we're looking not just at the chain of custody of a work of art, not just the sort of art, not using just art historical resources, but thinking about the historical circumstances under which objects changed hands, whether and to what degree duress played a role, and to fully consider not just whether an acquisition is legal, but also I think the ethics behind it.
Great. I wonder, Iris, could you speak to the changes that you've seen in Germany, having both worked in the US and Germany?
Yes. So in Germany, as you all know, most of the museums are actually public museums. And so the whole approach to the Washington Principles, the implementation of the Washington Principles at German museums went, I would say, through different funding channels. And of course, also our history, the direct involvement of German museums in the Aryanization of Jewish property also, puts a special historical, moral, ethical, and social responsibility on the German state. So the German federal government basically issued a joint declaration where it defined its endorsement of the Washington Principles, and with that actually came kind of what we call a user manual. It's called in Germany the Handreichung. It's approximately a 100-page document by which German provenance workers conduct research at the institutions they work at. And may I say, Tori, your position is a permanent position. My position is too. There are not that many permanent positions at German museums right now. When provenance research initiatives started, these were primarily project-based, 3-year initiatives funded by the German government and the state. And this has actually dramatically increased by what we call, the Gurlitt, post-Gurlitt phase, with the establishment of the German Lost Art Foundation. And I can share some slides and show you how our museum actually, we were funded twice by the predecessor of the German Lost Art Foundation, the Arbeitsstelle für Provenienzforschung. This is the first time we received funds, and the idea was actually to give museums funding in order to make research a more permanent thing at their institution, to trigger it, and then have the museums actually take care of it and fund it themselves. And the successor organization is the German Lost Art Foundation, and I will now try to share my screen with you. of course, these past 5 years, you've seen an increasing professionalization of internet resources, of funding resources, and also academic resources. We now have several positions in academia, professors teaching provenance and teaching the resources to future museum staff. Also, again, going back to the Handreichung, our manual, which includes recommendations for research and kind of a grid by which we follow and check, is this an object that was unlawfully taken from a victim of the Nazi regime. And very important, this is part of the Washington Principles, is of course the transparency, making research transparent. And I think in the US, you started very early, museums started very early putting their provenance data up online. In Germany, it was a bit different. We had basically a national database for registering, which is the Lost Art database. And it provides two functionalities. First, museums can register objects that they found during provenance research to be problematic. Second, also private individuals, institutions can register works they are looking for. So the idea is, of course, that they can be brought together, that they can be found. And with one of our projects, this was for our sculpture collection, we were funded by the German Lost Art Foundation. And in the course of this research, we discovered several objects that we then registered on the German Lost Art database, as you can see here. As you can see below, it includes our contact information, and also we cross-reference this information on our own website. And again, this is a commitment also that this is part of the requirements of the funding is, of course, to make your research, the results of your research, publicly accessible.
Very, very interesting. So it appears to have been the driving forces, both in the US and in Germany, appear quite similar, if the pace may be slightly different. Obviously of key importance is the investment into it. And it's fascinating to hear how it's developed to where we are now. And actually further question for you, Iris. I wondered, what happens when you just can't close the gap? At what point do you just concede and accept that it can't be bridged? And what does that do to the status of the object in the collection?
Well, I can give as an example our research project for the sculpture collection of the Liebig House. In that case, actually, 70% of the works that we researched did have provenance gaps. And in Germany, we work with what we call a traffic light system. Okay, so if we find an object that has been looted, this is red. Okay, a red flag. For the works that have gaps, we use the color yellow. And if a work has a provenance that is seamless and unproblematic, it's green. As you can imagine, these categories are not always as clean-cut, but yes, 70% of the collection, unfortunately, still have gaps in their object histories. And what we do then is, we try to, we have a German word for this, which we call ausforschen. Okay, we try to research it as best, try to allocate all the resources and the sources that we can get. And then once we reach an end, we say, okay, now is the time to publish what we have on our website, and hope that in the future new sources may come to light, or someone will look on our website and be able to draw a connection. And I can also show you an example of how we actually publish our provenance data online. here is an example of how we actually represent the provenance history of an object online. We decided to use this timeline. And if we have a gap, we use this ellipsis, which you can see here, the 3 dots, to indicate that we don't know what happened here, in the case of this object, between 1928 and actually 1952. And we explain that actually for our users. We explain how we represent the data online. And we also say, you know, this is an ongoing process. And if you have any questions or suggestions, please contact the museum.
So the work continues. I think that's the one thing that we know. It seems to be an endless engagement. I think one of the fascinating things about provenance research, when you can bridge the gaps, is the contextual information that you can glean about an object and its place in society, or society at the time the object changed hands. Suzanne, I know you've been working on a fascinating project about women donors at the National Gallery. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I wanted to share with you some new provenance history of a different type from the Nazi era, because as we mentioned at the beginning of the session, provenance obviously scans all periods and countries. And with the renewed interest in women in the arts, I thought it would be timely to look at our historical collections and say something fresh about the provenances related to women donors, about whom we know very, very little. I started trying to look into this matter, Teresa, and I found that we had disconnected the women from the very works of art. So a very basic task was to put the names back with a work or a group of works, and then to interrogate those works by asking some very basic questions and to see whether there were any patterns emerging from the results. So with a colleague, Christine Riding, we set about looking at 200 years of women donors in our history, asking who the women were, what they gave, what their motivations for being benefactors was, why maybe their work has been overlooked, their donations have been overlooked, and what we can do now, especially as we're coming up to our 200th birthday in 2024, to revivify their stories. And one of the things we found about women donors, and this is to answer your question because we found many interesting answers, which are all going to be published, by the way, if you want to know more, in December this year in the Journal of Art Historiography, which will be an overview of this project of 200 years of women benefactors and what we found. In the case of women, often the total extent of their collecting or curating has been overlooked because of certain things that happen in history. Either they only gave a part of their collection that they're in charge of to the National Gallery, or they were very generous across the board and gave different types of work. They often collected decorative arts as well as paintings, so that their collections got separated between institutions, or as institutions change, and we've discussed this a little bit in this panel already, some of their works have been transferred from one institution to another. And I just wanted to demonstrate this visually by a couple of examples, if you can bear with me. So in 1966, we had a bequest from a woman called May Rowley, who was a family descendant of John Julius Angustine, you can see in the oil portrait on the left, from whose collection 38 paintings were bought as a foundation collection of the National Gallery in 1924. So it was very nice that this female donor came up with actually a group of 10 works on offer. The National Gallery only accepted 2, these 2. They're both by Sir Thomas Lawrence. I've mentioned the oil portrait that we retain, but sadly, in a way, this wonderful drawing of Angustine's Russian nursemaid, the family's nurse, a woman called Isabel Smith, that was transferred to Tate. So the story between Augustine and the children's nanny has been lost sight of through a redistribution of artwork. So if you go into the provenance history and we look at the records and we can join the dots, as you were asking in the question, and find out a bit more about the range of collections that these women collected. And this is another example. I was very interested to find out a bit more about Lady Fitzgerald, Amelia Catherine Fitzgerald. And she and her husband collected a wonderful art collection full of many portraits by the likes of Joshua Reynolds and Thomas Lawrence and so on, and Gainsborough. And she also collected family portraits. Now, this is another example of works of art that should be really retained together that have been separated off. The portrait I show you on the left is of her mother, Mrs. Bishopsheim, by Sir John Everett Millais. And the other one I show you on the other side is her older sister, Ellen Odette, as a young teenager, by Louis Gustave Ricard. Now, when I looked into the correspondence in the Gary's archives, I found that Lady Fitzgerald had been persuaded that both pictures might go to the Tate to form a representative gallery of British art. But although both works did enter the Tate at Millbank after the war, Ricard's portrait of her sister was transferred subsequently to the National Gallery in 1956. So such stories can be multiplied many times over due to the way that British and modern foreign art is divided between the National Gallery and Tate. But at least by doing provenance research and investigating institutional records, we can start to join up. As Iris has just told us, it's very much sometimes looking for a needle in a haystack and very much an ongoing story, but at least we can start to set the historical record straight and join up a few of the dots, as I hope these two mini case studies have shown. And thereby we find that certainly the sum is greater than the parts.
Great, thank you, Susanna. Tori, I wonder if I could just turn to you quickly to ask you about the fine line between doing the research and interpreting the research.
So what I would say, sort of going back to what my role is at the museum, and I mentioned before, we're not bound by federal law, we're not bound by state law, we're a private institution. So in terms of sort of what my responsibilities are and how I look at due diligence, I always say we sort of take a three-pronged approach. Right? We have to consider law, we have to consider museum policy, and then we have to consider ethical guidelines. And we don't have a choice about whether or not to follow the law. We are, of course, bound by our own museum policy that guides our institution, our institutional needs, and from which we cannot stray without board approval. And then we also have to pay attention to the ethical guidelines that have been issued by our governing institutions, which are the AAM and the AAMD, the American Alliance of Museums and the Association of Art Museum Directors. My role within all this is to be neutral. I am not invested in the outcome, whether I'm working on a claim or whether I'm working on an acquisition. And I think this is another important reason to have a centralized role conducting provenance research in an institution. I'm not in any one department, and I push back a bit on our curators when I think perhaps they've maybe not asked enough questions. I think it's also quite possible for all of us to be really dazzled by an exciting new acquisition and to want it to go forward so much that it's very easy to take a leap of faith when really we need to push back a little bit more. I would say we also have to communicate very clearly to our donors and to our supporters about what our policies are, what our practices are. It's not fair to ask someone to buy something for us or to collect without letting them know what the industry standards are. So we owe that to them as sort of our financial stakeholders.
It's very interesting to hear how you approach it in the museum that, at the moment. Speaking about archival material, it can be very difficult, I think, to display it in a very engaging way. And I wondered, Iris, if you could let us know or tell us a little bit about the exhibitions that you've done where you've introduced this material, including the Beckman exhibition, which I understand is opening soon.
Yes. I'd like to begin, though, with a different example, if I may, actually, because it picks up on where I left it off, with a Provenance research project funded by the German Lost Art Foundation of the sculpture collection at the Liebig House, where we actually decided, because you have room for interpreting how you are going to make the results of your research accessible, and we decided to organize a small exhibition selecting 12 objects from the 400, very different objects histories. Some of them, it included examples of looted art, it included examples with gaps, it included examples of a so-called green provenance, so to build, to give an idea of the whole spectrum of acquisitions that occurred at the museum between 1933 and 1945. And now I'm going to share again some slides with you of the exhibition. This is the, outside of the Liebig House. The title of the exhibition was From Definite to Dubious, Objects and Their Histories. And unfortunately, this is in German, but you see here 12 objects tell the story of the museum's acquisition during the Nazi era. And they also tell you about the people at the museum and the people who previously owned these works, to tell their histories as well. And this is just an installation shot of the exhibition. Now, this was a sculpture exhibition, and this made it particularly, I would say, easy for us to give them the context, which you have to give in text form or through visual documents, through archival documents. And we decided to kind of let the history unfold around the objects. This is the example I showed you earlier of the object that we actually registered on the Lost Art database, an object with a provenance gap, an object with a previous Jewish owner. And we decided, we worked with exhibition designers who created these fold-up structures onto which we could actually project archival material, tell the story, and give a face to the people who previously owned that. Here, Harry Fuld, the previous owner of this work, or here, Agathe Salman. And this was an example, this is an object that we returned. And so we actually showed an empty pedestal, but still told the story of the objects. And then we connected it to a special online device, which we call Digitorial. We again chose 5 of the 12 stories to give users in-depth material. And I have to say the show was in German. For label information, we also give the information in English, but with the we had lots of text material on display. We didn't want to overburden the object, so we tried to solve it through creating a special brochure in English that visitors could get for free. So in order to actually understand the text that is provided on the structure around the sculptures. And just some more examples on how we tell, actually give an insight into provenance research and also into these individual stories. On our website, here you see below, you can click on special biographies that are featured. And then you get further documentation. And here you see, for instance, a historical image of the object that we returned when it was actually at the house of Agathe Salman, who had to sell her husband's collection at the bequest of the finance authorities in order to pay the Reichsflight tax.
And what was the feedback like, Iris, from the public?
Well, it was a small exhibition, but there was a lot of interest, specialized interest in the press, and we also had to do a lot of tours. We were a team of 3, And we always found, and I guess my colleagues, they can probably confirm that we always ended up taking so much more time to tell the stories. And there were so many questions, and people really appreciated that we actually made the context, the history behind the object visible for them, as well as the people who were once attached to these works. Yeah.
It looks to have been a fantastic exhibition. And was there a catalogue that accompanied it as well? Great.
A small project, I should say. Yes.
Great.
Yeah. In German
Okay.
and in English again, because a lot of the histories actually had to do with histories of migration and families in the US, and so we wanted to make sure that the story could be told also in the English language.
Great, thank you. Well, that is a wonderful note to wrap up this very insightful, very interesting discussion. Thank you all for all the time that you've spent preparing for this, but also for your time today. But before we close out, I have some questions that I have sourced externally to put to you. So I will read the question out, and whoever would like to take the question, go for it. The first question is, and obviously this is very meaningful for our membership, how important is the catalogue raisonné in your research? Iris, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I can just, again, my personal approach as a researcher, I think one of the first resources that I always consult is catalogue raisonné, and not only, for instance, with an artist like Max Beckmann. Since you mentioned the exhibition, there are a variety of raisonnés. There's a historical raisonné, which was actually written in the immediate post-war period in 1947 by someone, a journalist very close to Beckmann, who wrote in the 1920s quite a few reviews of his shows in the local press. And so these historical raisonnés are particularly, as primary sources, are particularly interesting material. And of course, of some of the raisonnés of the authors, there are papers in which you can actually see the different stages of editing. And another example is the catalogue raisonné of the artist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. It was written in the 1950s. And of course, in the 1950s, information about previous owners that may have been lost by now was still available. People were still alive. And yes, and another example is, since I'm also responsible for our archives, we recently acquired papers by an author of the catalogue raisonné close to an artist not very well known outside of Germany. She's a women artist, Ottilie Röderstein, and he wrote this raisonné. And that makes it a particularly interesting resource for provenance research. He wrote this raisonné during World War II, basically. Particularly since Röderstein is not such a well-known artist, she was a portrait artist. She portrayed many of the citizens in Frankfurt. Quite a few of them were Jewish, and a lot of works are now lost. The histories are lost. And this raisonné encapsulates a lot of these lost stories. So we're very happy we have that. And yes, raisonnés are absolutely important for provenance.
Great, as we hoped to hear. Next question, are considerations of provenance the same when an object is gifted to the collection? Susanna, would you like to take that one?
Yes, it is absolutely the same. All the same standards apply, whether you're thinking about checking the provenance, and if you need to, doing some due diligence. Those checking processes are identical, whether you're thinking about an exhibition loan, or whether you're thinking about a purchase, or a gift, or a bequest, or an AIL. And it should be noted, of course, that museums have the right to refuse a gift if there are gaps. If there are gaps, rather like the traffic light system, I mean, it is incumbent on us, before we say yes or no, to carry out a risk assessment to decide whether or not to acquire the gift. And then the final decision will need, in our case, the board decision of the National Gallery. But to answer your question, yes, the considerations are identical, whether it's a loan or a gift. Anything entering the National Gallery, which also applies across all UK museums because we all work to the same standards, whether it's a temporary presence in the gallery or a permanent gift, the standards should be the same.
Great, good to know. Tori, this is sort of related to the previous question, actually, but it's quite interesting, I suppose, to me. I'm often on the lender side, and I wondered when a work is, committed to an exhibition, how much provenance research is done by the museum in advance of the work arriving?
We do research and verify the provenance of all incoming loans. The museum is we're very active both lending and borrowing. If we are borrowing internationally, we may be applying for immunity from seizure. So that gives us a firm deadline by which we have to verify the provenance and ensure that there are no claims on anything coming in. We're obviously able to spend a little bit more time when objects come in individually, perhaps from a lender that we know well, than if we are getting 75 objects in at once for a loan exhibition. So I would say at a minimum, we want to make sure that there are no known claims, no known problems with anything that is coming in. But as I remind my colleagues and others, once we put something on the wall, we are sort of responsible for it, right? In other words, there's no real excuse for bringing something into the building if we don't know where it came from. So we do really need to make sure that we know what we're bringing in. And we certainly don't want a lawsuit to come in on someone else's property while it's hanging on your gallery wall, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then here's another exact sort of related question again. How complete must a provenance be to meet the museum's requirements? So is there a minimum requirement for provenance?
I would say that's an impossible question to answer. And again, particularly working at an encyclopedic institution where we have so many different kinds of objects that, each one represents a different type of risk, for lack of a better term. And we may be trying to answer different questions for different objects. So if we're bringing in a contemporary print, we may be asking only one or two questions about where it came from or if it had been imported properly. Whereas if we're bringing in a $2 million antiquity, we're going to go through a much more careful due diligence process and ask many more questions and probably ask for more paperwork. So there's no one single answer. There's no simple answer to that. But I will say, you have to begin with what you know, not with what you don't know, and sort of go from there. There's no one answer.
Another question: what if the work does not have any attribution? What sort of problems does that pose?
I'm happy to keep talking, but if anyone else wants to jump in, they can. This is a question that I grapple with a lot. We have been over the last couple of years actively acquiring Dutch and Flemish paintings. This is something that's been announced. We have two really wonderful collections of Dutch and Flemish paintings coming in. And what we've noticed is that, of course, attributions change over time. And so whether you're bringing in something that has no artist name attached, or whether you're bringing something in where the attribution is very, very recent. In other words, maybe this is one of those proverbial found in the attic paintings. Nobody knew who it was really by. Someone cleaned it. It's got a brand new attribution. How in the world do you trace something like that if you don't know what the artist's name was when it was last sold? And so you have to think about other ways to try to search for this object. So if there's a distinctive subject matter, you have to think about what about this object is unlikely to have changed over time, right? So in many cases, that is the dimensions, but you have to be careful because condition can change. You know, with antiquities, there can be restorations that are removed or taken off. So I think you really have to have a good understanding of what the object is before beginning the provenance research process, and whether that's you know, an acquisition, a loan, or something that's in the collection.
And in London, we've got one wonderful resource, which is the Warburg Photo Library. And that obviously is catalogued by subject rather than artist. So one resource that we often recommend our curators to go to, because normally if we had a bit more knowledge about the artist, we might say go to the Whit Library at the Courtauld Institute, because that's done by artists, or you could go to the Frick Reference Library, which has lots of online material in the US, or the Arcade in the Netherlands. But just on your very interesting point, Teresa, about if it's a, you know, we don't know the artist, there is one wonderful resource that I hope people know about, but it's at the Warburg, as I say, and it's done by subject. So they're very, very detailed lists of the Virgin child looking to the left, looking to the right, shepherds, kings, animals, whatever. And it's all done in this absolutely wonderful composition. And so there is actually one unique resource that actually can get you, if you're lucky, the needle in the haystack. You can actually get to the painting without actually knowing who the author is. And of course, they have information on the back of that painting that gets you one stage further. But there are individual repository sources that you can go to alongside Catalogue Raisonné, photographic archives and sale catalogues and so on. But in this case, that's the absolute key example, the Warburg Photographic Library. That might get you your answer, Teresa.
Great, well, thank you for that tip. And we just have a few minutes left, so I would like to just pose this final question to all of you. Obviously, a lot has changed in the past, let's say, 20 years. I wondered how you see things going forward. What is the future of provenance research in the museum world?
Well, I think certainly the United Kingdom is probably playing a little bit of catch up especially with Germany and what Tori's been explaining in the USA. I mean, we certainly haven't had designated research posts like the position that Iris and Tori hold until relatively recently. A colleague of mine who's actually now in the Yale Centre of British Art, actually in America, she was appointed, this is Antonia Bartley, at the British Library to do provenance research. And I think that was the first case of someone designated in the UK. And then much more recently, Jacques Schumacher at the Victoria and Albert Museum was given, I believe, a temporary post, but at least full time, to look first of all at some sculptures and paintings, but now is looking into the Gilbert collection, which is full of silverware and stuff boxes. But I just wanted to say that we're trying to join up the dots a bit more and share the information. So Jacques not only was researching his own museum's provenances, especially for the Nazi era, but he has put online and organises these very nice seminars that he encourages all UK museum people to go along to. And also he put on an exhibition rather like Iris was mentioning, her wonderful exhibition, that is still actually going on at the moment in the Victoria and Albert Museum, telling stories for the first time in the UK about provenances which have not been resolved during the Nazi era. So to answer your question, at least from the UK's point of view, I think we will be trying to dedicate posts to this type of research, and also I think trying to share knowledge and best practice. So for example, I and other members of the museum community throughout the UK sit on the spoliation working group, and we advise the Directors' Council, and we meet normally before the pandemic 2 or 3 times a year, and we try to bring colleagues up to date with what we're all doing in our respective institutions, share best practice, and then develop ways forward. So one new initiative that we're working on at the moment is myself and Jacques Schumacher and Antonio Bartley I mentioned are joining forces to try and build up a little workshop. And we were going to make it a travelling Provenance food show thing, that we could have invited people across the country, and we would have had our first one in Southampton City Art Gallery this summer, where we could invite UK colleagues to come along and learn. And this would be a new way forward that you're talking about, Teresa, of sharing best practice. Sadly, because we're on lockdown, that couldn't happen. So we're beginning to think, well, we're all so much better now on digital platforms. We could do something in that regard next year. But my point to you is, if I were to project forward on the UK landscape, we are beginning to see museums taking action and paying for posts. And in fact, I heard that in May, the museums in Greenwich, they are going to be supporting a post now, which is very exciting, especially as their collections were built up during the 1930s. And this idea of sharing information in a national body, advising directors of best practice, and then this roadshow. That's just a few examples of what the UK is trying to do to join up the dots and not repeat work when time and effort and money are in short supply.
Wonderful. I love this idea of the travelling Provenance roadshow.
I'll keep you posted.
I look forward to that. So on that note, I would like to thank all of you for your time today on this panel, which was wonderful, very enlightening, very valuable insights that you offered all of us. And I personally am so impressed by all of the work that you do. I'm amazed that you've even had this time to devote to us today. So thank you sincerely. And good luck with your ongoing Provenance research.
Thank you.